From things like unique stylization and concept arts from later Animal Crossing games, to some of the earliest prototypes of the entire Animal Crossing franchise, there are a lot of different Animal Crossing designs and appearances that dramatically changed over the course of development. With there being 5 main games and a handful of spin-offs, we wanted to look at what we know of the concept arts and early prototypes of the Animal Crossing franchise. Let's start at the very beginning with Animal Forest for the Nintendo 64. Of course, this game was Dobutsu no Mori, only released in Japan on the N64, but later would be revised and localized to have more releases. But that original Nintendo 64 version of the game actually didn't have a museum, as many of you know. Blathers, who was not in the first version of the game as the museum wasn't there, had an early character build found in the files where he looks like this. It's a primitive design. Yeah, they changed him up quite a bit, but honestly, look at this. I'd die for this. While we've talked about the development of Animal Crossing and how in the early stages of the game it was more of a dungeon crawling life simulator mix, in a mega leak from a few years ago, there were some assets found in a beta build of Dobutsu no Mori that had some extra characters that weren't actually in the game. These 3 are particularly interesting as they look nothing like anything actually found in Animal Crossing, neither are they related to any furniture items in the game. It is very possible that these characters are left over from when the game was a different type of experience, being more of a action-oriented game, but it does make us wonder, when did the whole Animal Crossing art style begin with the villagers and whatnot? Unfortunately for us, when it comes to the early stages of Animal Crossing at the beginning, the development process is still very, very vague. There's not a whole lot out there, so we're left to speculate, but fortunately enough, later Animal Crossing games actually reveal a lot about the development periods there. Still, there were a couple of other interesting things found in this beta that does give us a little bit of context. Like for instance, the little ghost character Wisp had an alternate version as well, which we can see how this character would later be redesigned from this to this. And then we've talked about these next 2 in cut characters videos we've done in the past, but there was Shocky and another cat villager that both aren't a part of the game. Shocky was likely some sort of special event character, and Cat 13 likely was cut due to its appearance and Nintendo already being criticized for some of the appearances of other characters that they had in other properties. Nintendo probably just wanted to play it safe. When it comes to Animal Crossing Wild World, the second game in the series for the Nintendo DS, unfortunately this game alone has probably the least amount of details as to what was going on during the development phases of the game. The only real thing that we could go off of is that way back in the Wild World days, there was an E3 presentation a year before the game actually released, and it was just Animal Crossing DS, and very much so you can see that this version of the game from the gameplay was more based off of the GameCube version of the game, though it was a different build, not just like a picture-in-picture smoke and mirrors type concept video. The camera follows the player, which is different than how the GameCube uses like the Acre system to move the camera, so we know it is something custom built for the DS. Though the aesthetic of the character looks so much like the GameCube version, which would later be overhauled to allow you to do stuff like take hats off and whatnot. I really wish there was more like prototype drawings out there for Wild World that were shared publicly, but being able to see the difference from what this game looked like early in development to what it looked like after its actual release is still something. After Animal Crossing Wild World released though, there was an anime film that came out only in Japan, and you know, I looked really hard trying to find any type of behind the scenes, storyboards, anything that we could find just that could show the process of making the film. And honestly, there's not a lot out there. I did find one promotional image that showed some of the characters who look slightly different than they look in the anime illustration form. So maybe this specific promotional art was done while the film was in production, which is what I believe this image is from. Similarly, Animal Crossing City Folk, which was for the Nintendo Wii, didn't have too much conceptually that we get to look at, but there are a couple of things that are worth noting. Like for instance, in this E3 presentation where they're talking about some of the features of Animal Crossing City Folk, you can notice some art changes in a lot of the textures that are used for pathways, but also Gracie Grace has a completely different logo in this build of the game versus what we see in the actual release of Animal Crossing. Okay, there was also this image that was used as promotional art for Animal Crossing City Folk, which I find very interesting. Not only do we see a little bit more of the tops of the buildings in the city, but there is this whole area behind the city that is obviously not a location accessible in the real version of the game. This could just be art to represent something other than the city, even though there already is art like that that exists showing the main town that you would play in. This is all speculative, but I do wonder if at some point there were plans to have something else beyond the city, kind of like what we had in Happy Home Houses. But yeah, it's interesting. Maybe there was a place we would have ridden our bus to beyond the city. That would have been really cool, but I guess we never got it. Now, when it comes to games like Animal Crossing New Leaf and New Horizons, there's actually surprisingly a lot of information about the production phases for these games and the development. Animal Crossing New Leaf is especially interesting. Aya Kyogoku, who was promoted to the role of director for New Leaf, has actually talked extensively in interviews and presentations about the approach that they took with Animal Crossing New Leaf. The main idea was to take seeds that represented the core aspects of the Animal Crossing games and base them as the foundation for the new project, and making sure that those core ideas are known by the entire team. Then from there, they would plant new seeds with new unique ideas based on whatever they could come up creatively or what hardware limitations there were. Now, there is some early planning concept art that I think is really interesting. Like, for instance, they made the decision pretty early on that Tom Nook's role would evolve from where he was in Animal Crossing City Folk, and we would see him running the Nook Homes business. This concept art right here kind of shows just a little taste of what his business front looked like early in the planning phases. A simple yellow building with a little rhino dinosaur looking figure over here. I don't know what this is. It was very obvious at this point they were ready to put Tom Nook into a sweater, but back in these days, they had him suited out in a yellow sweater instead of the green sweater that we are more familiar with from Animal Crossing New Leaf specifically. Okay, now to be fair, Tom Nook does have a yellow jacket he occasionally wears, so this idea did kind of live on, but you get what I mean as an overall appearance of this character, mostly wearing the green sweater, at least from the New Leaf days before, New Horizon updated his look once again. Also in this concept art, Tom Nook appears to have belts, pants, and shoes, where his redesign in the final version of this game would just revert him back to simple dress pants and no shoes needed. I think I ultimately like the final design better, but I do think the yellow sweater is very interesting nonetheless. There was also this piece of concept art, which is probably one of my favorite New Leaf concept arts that we've ever seen, where it's like a far out view of what a typical Animal Crossing town would look like. It was originally inspired to be this cliffside town, and it seemed like early on they had a pretty good grasp on what the town was supposed to look like. Interestingly, during the prototyping phases, the main street was referred to mostly as a mall, which, realistically it is kind of like an outlet mall up here, but it was kind of toned down to be more of like a street you would walk down with all of the shops. They had the model homes up here, then the main village down here, the beach, and of course the train tracks going right through the middle of the town. Down in the southernmost part of the map here, you can see another little island, likely what I thought to be maybe Tortimer's Island. This one's kind of interesting though, because it does look like, in at least this concept art, there's maybe more going on the island than what you actually see in the game, where in the game it's just like one building and some trees and stuff. Here, there's like more buildings and maybe like a fountain in the middle or something, and some villagers. I don't know, maybe there was bigger things planned for this separate island that you would get to travel to. The dock down here, interestingly, has a building, and actually if you look up at the beach in the main part of the town, there's a dock over there that also has a building associated with it. Otherwise, this map's a cool little exploration of what an Animal Crossing village would look like in New Leaf. Later on, in a developer roundtable, they talked a bit about Animal Crossing in the planning phases and what were important for what they wanted to see in the game, and you can see some concept art about how the idea and design for an Animal Crossing character would look and evolve. And then if we remember back all the way to the first reveal trailer of Animal Crossing New Leaf, way back before they even announced the fact that there would be the name New Leaf or that we would be the mayor, we did know we would get to swim. That was a big deal, and to an extent it makes sense as to why in the concept art for this town map that we were just looking at, there's a lot of these little like rocks and islands outside in the ocean, likely as an idea, places that you would get to swim to, even if in New Leaf we didn't really get to go swimming to too many locations. Also, I do think it's interesting to look at this artwork showing the redesign of villagers from what they used to look like to what they looked like in New Leaf, showing how the characters were taller to give more clothing options to whoever was playing the game. This shows like a comparison in concept art form, which is pretty cool. And then obviously one of the biggest things from New Leaf that we got was the introduction of essentially the newest mascot character for the series in the form of Isabelle. But Isabelle wasn't a character that was taken lightly in the introduction. They had an idea of what they wanted to do with the character, but from this concept art you can see there were various different versions of the character drawn up before they settled on the final design of what Isabelle would actually end up looking, which was a Bag of Bells inspired design for Isabelle, because she is a bell. We've made this joke before. It's just gonna come up time and time again, I'm sorry. Nonetheless, it's cool to see the other designs and what they started with and what they led into before they ultimately settled on this design that we know for Isabelle that would be the main design that she would have for the future of the series. Then there was also this art that showed the height differences of Animal Crossing characters with the old Gen 2 designed villager standing next to the different height variations of villagers, and then the updated Gen 3 height of villagers, showing that now the villager is slightly taller than cat villagers, where before they were slightly shorter. But otherwise, most of the character height scaling stayed the same for villagers as well. Okay, this next one is really interesting because it happened after the release of Animal Crossing New Leaf, but when they first announced that the villager was going to become a Super Smash Bros. Character, there's some interesting oddities about the little teaser trailer that they showed off for the game. Now, obviously, this is a CGI trailer just showing the character coming from the Animal Crossing world to go to play in Smash Bros. And this was 2 years after New Leaf released. What I find really interesting, though, is that the villager that is in Smash Bros. Is based off of the Gen 2 Animal Crossing villager, like the Wild World City Folk villager that's much shorter, even though Smash Bros. Introduced this character well after the redesign for the Gen 3 character that made him a little bit taller was already implemented into the game series. Even more interesting is in this trailer, we see Tom Nook wearing his Animal Crossing New Leaf clothing, despite the fact that the villager is clearly from City Folk and not from New Leaf, which makes me wonder if Smash Bros. 4 had been in development for so long at that point, that the idea to implement the character was made long before Animal Crossing New Leaf had already decided to go ahead with redesigning the character. Also, just a little side note, not really worth mentioning for development stuff, but I just wanted to bring it up anyways. All the villager characters from the trailer, well, there's 2 of them, are the 2 main characters from the Animal Crossing anime film. When it comes to Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, there's actually not too much to go off of for concept art, though there was one image released that showed various versions of the tent that would be such a focal part of the Pocket Camp experience that they did reveal at one point, and it kind of shows how smaller objects would look in comparison to the tent and what the villagers would kind of look like in scope with the tent. It was kind of interesting. Also, in Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival, there's not too much to go off of, but in this one promotional art picture, Digby is wearing a hat, and in the game, he doesn't wear a hat. What happened to Digby's hat? Why did they get rid of it? Well, also, what happened to Digby? Why did they get rid of him in just Animal Crossing in general? I have so many questions. But then, Animal Crossing New Horizons honestly takes things just a step further when we look at the total amount of interesting things that changed during the development stages to what we saw at the final release of the game. There's actually this whole article that Famitsu magazine put out a few years back when they interviewed some of the developers of Animal Crossing New Horizons, and it is very interesting how game design theory played a massive role in the development of what Animal Crossing New Horizons was. Like, for instance, they showed off a couple of demonstrative pictures from the game themselves, showing how when you look at this screen, for example, there are a lot of engaging factors on your screen that could all be interacted with and played with in one way or another, and that was kind of their design philosophy when making Animal Crossing New Horizons. In past games, the sky would sometimes just be this blank space taking up one of your screens on like the DS, for example, and they chose to make sure the camera angle was focused on what was happening in a place where you would have the most things on your screen that you could choose to do and work on, rather than having like a blank sky that had nothing to do. And then they incorporated the sky in like the different way where you could look up with a slingshot. Instead, all of these objects are known as quote unquote opportunities to play. They also showcase this interesting chart that shows how different items, objects, characters, and players can relate to each other. And at first, it just looks like this weird timeline that makes no sense, but this whole chart actually played into some of their playstyle choices and design about how different insects, bugs, and whatnot could play into the progression of a museum, for example. This then tied into this whole other theory about symbolism of images and whatnot. It gets a little more confusing, especially because there's like translation discrepancies between how it's written in Japanese and how I'm trying to interpret it based off of a translated page of the article. The main takeaway is there was a lot of very intentional decisions with the design philosophy in Animal Crossing New Horizons that probably go over most of our heads, and we think a lot of things are coincidental when really they were kind of calculated ahead of time. There's also some really unique images that were shared at CEDEC 2020 where they did this like presentation on Animal Crossing and its symbolic design that showed how a lot of the natural patterns that we see, like especially when relating to nature itself, like grass, rock, or trees, oftentimes are inspired by real patterns that are found in nature. And there were different photographs used to kind of showcase how patterns found in the real world were used as a starting point for the patterns we see in Animal Crossing. Now, for the sake of this presentation, they were talking about New Horizons, but a lot of this really applies to the philosophy that the entire series has always had. They also showed that in the earlier stages of Animal Crossing New Horizons development, I mean, look at this image. This is quite different from what we actually see in the game. They toyed around with texturing over the main grass textures to try to give this three-dimensional look, and while they ended up refining it a bit and changing it up and doing things like flowers and weeds to kind of give that three-dimensional look, this like third-dimensional texture is something they did end up applying to like the look of a lot of the villagers. Interestingly enough, in Animal Crossing New Horizons, there was a lot of emphasis put onto how villagers could end up looking at a distance where you could see their silhouettes and know who they are, which would serve as another opportunity to play even if you are further in a distance. Cats are kind of used as the main example here, but it is interesting how they kind of put this as a forefront design philosophy this early on. Okay, we do get some actual concept art of a couple of villagers that were shown here, just like little designs that were done for newer types of villagers introduced in New Horizons. They're simple sketches, but still, I mean, they're cool to see this version. I mean, they look pretty close to what we actually saw in the final version of the game. An interesting concept that the development team and design team used when making Animal Crossing New Horizons characters was to intentionally design the characters in a style that is slightly different from the style that Animal Crossing is known for. And while honestly some of these characters look a little bit cursed, this was actually just an exercise to get ideas of other details that they could include in New Horizons that maybe didn't exist in the pre-existing art style that they had. An example of how this evolved is shown right here in these two pictures. These two villagers look pretty normal, but you can see a little bit of detail to the eyes can go a really long way, and that might have been something not originally considered, but in some villager cases, it does help convey their emotions and personality in a way different way than what they would have had, which adds more variety when some characters do have different types of eyes. Also, they pointed out some other little small design changes that they did that went a long way. On a lot of the villagers, they ended up changing the shapes of some of the features of villagers themselves. Like on the 3DS and previous games, Animal Crossing characters usually had like a cylindrical shape to them, but to make them feel a little more lifelike, they changed the shape to be more like the shape of like French bread or something like that. Small details you really wouldn't think about unless you actually had them pointed out, and I think these things are really cool. They also did other little changes like recurving the shape of the torso to kind of give a little bit more of like a poochier belly and a little arch to the back. A little bend to the knee never hurt anyone. And then of course, one of the biggest things that fans were hyped about were how some villagers got little paw pads added to the bottom of their feet. A simple detail, but people did notice when this one was added. They also went into a ton of really interesting detail about how different things such as furniture are designed, and wow, I was actually really surprised with how much thought goes into the design of simple furniture pieces like a fan, for example. I mean, they really think things through on how it's going to look, how it's going to work, and how it's going to interact with like the universe and player. Like for instance, this fan, when they first designed it, they were like, wow, it's a little bit small. So they slightly redesigned it, made it a little bit taller so it would be the perfect height to blow in the player's face. I'm telling you, other Animal Crossing knockoff games miss these little details, and they really do go a long way. They spend a lot of time talking about the other furniture and the different types of varieties that the furniture can come in. I do think it's interesting when we get to see like the real life pictures that were used to inspire some of the furniture items found in New Horizons, like these ones, for example. But this is significant because it actually does tell a lot about how they had to think about proportions, because obviously something like a lighthouse is massive. It's going to be like bigger than small objects. So they had to kind of scale things back a little bit and then use height as the main point to convey the largeness of an item in a lot of cases, and they did a really good job with this. And then they even went into like little interactable items, like that little bamboo shoot that like shoots a little creature out at you. Yeah, look at that. There's like concept art on how they planned on this whole thing working. And then lastly, we also have these images showing some other early ideas for Animal Crossing villagers that would then be obviously updated and turned into real villagers. And honestly, that marks pretty much the end of everything we know about Animal Crossing New Horizons. And at the very least, as much as we complain about not getting new updates for Animal Crossing games on a regular basis, the fact that we do get to see these details, and when they do presentations like this and share stuff like what we saw with New Horizons online, we get a little bit of a better understanding as to why sometimes the games take so long, because there is a lot of attention to detail, and that is really awesome. Now, obviously, we hope we get a new Animal Crossing game soon, and hopefully the foundations that they've built for for all these other games will help lead into that and the future of the series, but we'll have to wait and find out. If you enjoyed this video though, make sure you're subscribed. If you want to see more Animal Crossing content from yours truly, that's me, Rocket Elijah, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We'll see you guys next time with a brand new video.